Do you struggle with choosing colors for your colorwork creations? How do you know if the colors that you pick are going to look good once you do a stranded pattern or intarsia or something with a lot of really intricate color shifts? Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. Thank you for joining me so much. If you're a new viewer, welcome to the podcast, and if you are a returning viewer, welcome back. Thank you guys so much too for all of the support and encouragement and congratulations and good wishes that I received after last week's video when I did my pregnancy announcement. And if you missed it, last week I was just letting people know that Mr. Potion Yarns and I are expecting our first baby in October. So this is a fun but slightly scary and exciting time for us. And so I'm sure that will change and have some effect on my business from time to time as well. But for now, we're just going to keep pressing on and do what we can. But it has changed a little bit. I'm not going to talk about it a ton probably on the podcast, but I have noticed that it's changing like the things that I cast on and some of the things that I consider, just because I tend to like to knit a lot of sweaters, and with my body shape changing rapidly, I am a little bit less excited about knitting garments and sweaters this year, especially because I really like sweaters that are very fitted. And so you tend to make them with like negative ease so that they stretch and they fit you like a glove. And I do knit some things that are a little bit roomier and bulkier, so I may still try to do a couple of those just because I can't imagine going a whole year without knitting a sweater at all. But I've been focusing a lot more on like shawls and fingerless gloves and stuff like that lately, because it doesn't seem so scary to try and figure out how I'm going to fit something when I don't know what my body is going to be like next month. So yeah, thank you guys for everyone who sent me some kind wishes and good comments. I really appreciate the support that I've received from you guys. It's really awesome and it's exciting, and I'm glad that you guys get to share this journey with me. But today, if you hadn't already guessed from the intro, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects when it comes to fiber arts. I am so excited because I've been wanting to do this video for about a year, and early on when I was first starting my podcast, I was just really nervous all the time and struggling to just get in the groove and get the feel for my videos, and working on technical difficulties and everything else. And then I kind of chickened out several times. I thought about doing this episode like many times over the last year, and every time I chickened out because I didn't want to just rush it and throw it together. I wanted to do a really good job. But I finally decided that I am tired of avoiding it, and it's a really important topic, and it's one that I get asked about a lot. So we're going to do a video today and just try to break it down into bite-sized chunks and talk about it. And that is choosing yarn colors for your projects. And specifically, we will have some other videos at some point down the road about other topics related to choosing colors for different projects. But today, I wanted to talk about choosing colors for color work. So when I say color work, I'm talking like Fair Island stranded color work, I'm talking intarsia, mosaic knitting, things where there will be a lot of color shifts back and forth over short amounts of stitches. I'm not talking about like color blocks or striping, where you just like stripe a color for several rows and then do another color or whatever. I'm talking about several different things. I have several things to show you here today. So last year I knit Boyland Knitworks pattern, the Sunset Highway sweater, and this yoke has some stranded knitting in it, where you are using two colors on each row, but you have multiple colors in through the yoke here, and you've got these patterns, and it looks like they're kind of like waving back and forth, and that's just created from several rows of doing color work charts. So that's an example of like a stranded knitting pattern. I do have a Fair Isle sweater that I did several years ago. This is a big, bulky, like coat type of sweater. But and I just used Knit Picks palette yarn on this one. But this was actually the first Fair Isle full-size sweater that I had ever done. And unfortunately, I didn't actually use steeks because the pattern I found didn't have steeks in them. Oh, Phoebe, stop. Phoebe's playing with my sleeves. But I did get a chance to practice my stranded colorwork knitting when I was still kind of new at it. And this sweater's getting a little ratty because it's pretty old, but I love it. And when you have a lot of small patterns like these in traditional Fair Isle, you're having a lot of color shifts, and there's a lot of back and forth and little tiny patterns that make these tiny geometric little patterns across the sweater. When you have that, if you don't choose wisely, your yarns can end up not having enough contrast so that they kind of all blend together, and you can't see the individual motifs that you put all that work into knitting. So if you're putting in, like this sweater, I don't remember how many colors I used, but I want to say it was more than 10. It was probably at least 9 or 10, maybe even more. And that was a lot of work. I mean, this thing took me the better part of a year, including a couple breaks that I set it down for. But it was a big, huge amount of work. And so after putting all that work in, and you're knitting this on like a size 3 needle or something with fingering weight yarn, you don't want to get done and then stand back and look at it and you're like, oh, well, it just looks like a blended blur of color. I can't really tell like the individual shapes and all those cute little motifs that I worked so hard on. You can't tell it. So you have to make sure that you pick colors that have a lot of contrast. Phoebe, thank you, Phoebe. And another example that I wanted to show you guys is another one I knit last year, which is my floozy cardigan. I have worn this on the podcast before. This is actually a slip stitch pattern as opposed to a stranded. It mimics the look of a Fair Isle or stranded yoke, but it is actually knit using slipped stitches instead of stranding your colors. So you only knit with one color per row, and you're just going to knit some of the stitches and slip some of the stitches, and then on the next row you'll be knitting the ones that you slipped. So that's how you get this really cool pattern. And these were kits that I did last year in the shop. So this is all my hand-dyed yarn, and the designer has the floozy cardigan on Ravelry, so you can look that one up as well. But those are some examples, excuse me. Those are some examples of a couple different types of color work, and hopefully that'll help you understand what I'm talking about when we talk about needing contrast. I worked really hard on the kits I created for this sweater. I had four different kits for it, and I worked really hard on choosing colors that would go together so that when you were slipping the stitches here, there was enough contrast that you could actually see the color work, as opposed to getting it all done and being like, oh, I can't really see what's going on there. Like, it all just kind of blends together. This colorway that I chose actually was the girly kit, so it's all pinks and white. And so this one had actually the least amount of contrast. All of my other ones had more contrast in them. They were darker colors like mustards and golds and browns and aqua blues and things like that. And this one had the least amount of contrast, and I still think it turned out just fine because I put a lot of work into making sure I picked good enough colors that they would work. But I remember when I first knit my swatch, I got really nervous that the white and the light pink background color weren't going to be dark enough to contrast. So I was so relieved. I just kept knitting my swatch and made it bigger, and I was really relieved that the pattern came out just fine after it was knit up and blocked. But yeah, this is something that you really need to put work into choosing your colors, because if you don't make the proper choice, it can ruin your project. And especially if you're using a nice quality yarn like an indie dyed yarn or a nice yarn from your local yarn store, you don't want to put all of that money and work into something and then have it turn out to just be like bleh and not have any great contrast. This also works with intarsia, which I don't really knit much intarsia. I have done some before, but I couldn't find any examples that I had around the house of intarsia that I've done. Honestly, I am not great with intarsia, and it is one of my goals to get better at it in the future, but I haven't done a whole lot of it. But this same concept works really, really well with intarsia. It's the exact same thing. If you don't have enough contrast, you won't be able to see the clearly defined lines and shapes of your knitting. And for those of you that don't know, intarsia is like kind of like painting with yarn. So for example, my first intarsia project I did years and years ago was a cushion cover for like a pillow, for a sofa pillow. And I knit with a dark chocolate brown background color. And then in the middle of the pillow was this silhouette of a young girl, like a cameo type of silhouette. And so the young girl's silhouette was in like a light beige. And so I had the dark chocolatey brown and the light beige, and it was really, really pretty. And I would just knit with the chocolate brown until I got to the part where the cameo started, and then I'd drop that yarn and I'd pick up the beige and I'd knit across until I was done with whatever the chart said was that row. And then I would pick up the chocolate brown on the other side. So you have to have like multiple balls of yarn going if you're doing intarsia. And that was like a super simple, just one big motif in the center, 2 colors, really simple. But there are really intricate intarsia patterns that you can do that use 20 colors or more. And you've got all these little bobbins and butterflies of yarn going on. And it's really impressive, but it's really complicated. At least it is to me. So that's another example of a great time to make sure that you're choosing good colors, because it can ruin your project. Like I mentioned, mosaic or slip stitch knitting is definitely one. Also, I find that sometimes, depending on what motifs I'm working with, sometimes this can also apply to even like brioche projects and things. So I recently showed this on the podcast for Saturday Night at the Movies a couple weeks ago, but this is the Coffee at the Grand stole that I knit by Leslie Robinson. I love this stole. It's absolutely beautiful, and this is an example of one where it's not imperative that you pick high contrast colors, but the designer specifically recommended in her pattern. I used my own hand-dyed yarn, so I was not using what she used in hers, but I did choose kind of similar colors because she specifically recommended that you're using 3 different yarns, and she suggested that you have one dark, one light, and one medium shade, so that there would be more contrast. So you could see the big division between the stripes. You could see in the slip stitch pattern at the ends, you could see the really nice colors contrasting and creating this really cool like slip stitch pattern. And I wanted mine to look a lot like hers because I loved the high contrast that she had. I did look through several of the projects on the project page on Ravelry, and some people had chosen colors that didn't have as much contrast, almost more like a fade. And while they were really pretty, and I don't think that it ruined the pattern at all, it was just a different effect. So that was an example of when it's not going to make or break or like ruin your project, but you'll get a different effect if you choose to knit something like this with yarns that are more of a fade or a really subtle contrast, as opposed to, I specifically chose 3 colors that had a very high contrast because I wanted to see that light, dark, and medium contrast between the 3 and get those really clearly defined stripes and layers in my pattern. And I'm really happy with how that turned out. So those are all examples of when you might actually want to pay more attention to your yarn selections other than just, oh, these are pretty, I'll put these together. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up is because when I travel around to trunk shows and yarn events, like yarn shows and festivals and stuff, one of the top questions I get from customers in my booth is about helping them select colors for specific patterns, or even if they don't have a specific pattern, just what colors look good together. Can you pick 3 skeins of fingering weight that would look good together, and then I'll go find a pattern on Ravelry, right? And I love helping people make color choices. It's something that I do frequently for my online customers as well as my in-person customers. I try to make sure that I do color pairings on my Instagram and Facebook every so often to help give you guys examples of colors that look great together, especially if they're colors that you might not necessarily have thought to put together and things like that. So I love doing those, but I understand that there's a big difference between just colors that look pretty together in the skein and things that knit up together well. So one of the challenges as a knitter is that you have to be able to envision how these are going to look knit up. And a lot of us are not that great at that. I'll be honest, even now that I dye yarn, I'm not great at that. I can get an idea, but I still have to swatch with indie dyed yarn, especially sometimes, because I'm just like, oh gosh, this looks so pretty, but I'm having a hard time envisioning what this is gonna look like. So sometimes I have to swatch it before I even know, is this a sweater yarn, a shawl yarn, a sock yarn, whatever. And I think that it can really help you improve in your confidence when you just learn a few tips and tricks that will help you select colors with confidence. So today we're going to talk specifically about color work, like I mentioned, intarsia and stranded and all of those types of things. And I want to help you get some ideas of how you can choose colors. So I brought some of my hand-dyed yarns down so that we could play around a little bit with them. So like for instance, this is one of my brand new colors that just went in the shop this week called Day Drinker. It's a really pretty little kind of bright light aqua, very summery, poolside kind of a color. And when I was looking through some of my dyed yarns upstairs, I was really drawn to this old colorway that I have called 10-Year-Old Japanese Ninja. It's a really light mint with some multicolored speckles, dark speckles like chocolatey browns and kind of a deep sapphire blue and some golds and things like that. So speckled and a tonal. And I was looking at these two and I thought, oh my gosh, these look so pretty together. And they absolutely do. But if I was just shopping around, like these two look good together, right? They look really pretty. But what I discovered using the trick I'm going to show you guys in just a minute, I discovered these actually are not good choices if I'm doing a stranded pattern. Like if I was doing a floozy cardigan that's like a slip stitch that looks like a stranded, if I was doing that, these would not have enough contrast to show up and really show off the pattern. They would be more of like a fade yarn or more of a subtle contrast. They'd look great in something like the Coffee at the Grand because I wouldn't, if I didn't mind having less of a contrast, they would look great in something like that. They'd look great in stripes or other types of bold blocks of color instead of little tiny patterns. But they don't look good when I need that really intense definition. So I looked around at some other things. Here's another speckle called Is This a Kissing Book? It's got a white background with some bright blue and purpley pink speckles all over it. This provides much more contrast, so this would actually work well as a stranded color work or something of that type. Also, I picked out a nice dark bright blue tonal called Gershwin. These two look stunning together. They'd look great in stripes, they'd look great in a fade, they'd look great in color work, literally anything. There's a lot of contrast. Now these ones are really easy to tell that there's contrast, right? Because this is pretty dark and this one's really light. White background versus a sapphire blue background. Pretty easy. You don't need to use the trick for this one. You just know these will be a good contrast. But how did I know that these two weren't going to be great together? So I teach this trick at a lot of my trunk shows to individuals, and I wanted to put it out there for you guys so that you have access to this whenever. And I cannot honestly claim credit for this trick because I did not invent it. And I'm going to be really honest, I don't remember where I learned this. I learned it years and years ago, and I don't remember if it was from another knitter in my knitting circle, if it was from a book I read, if it was just a suggestion I saw on the internet. So I apologize to whoever's idea this was originally, but it's a brilliant idea, and I teach it to a lot of people. All you need for this is the yarn that you're trying to come up with colors. So however many skeins, if you're doing 4 skeins, 8 skeins, 2 skeins, whatever colors you need. And you can do this with your own stash yarn at home, but you can also do this at your local yarn store or a yarn festival if you can either hold it in your hands or find a place where you can lay out your yarn. You will need to lay them out next to each other. And then the only other thing that you need is a smartphone with a camera on it. And you can use a pretty basic phone. My sister, I tease her because she is not big into technology, and she has like the oldest phone in existence, and it's still one of the old flip phones, and she doesn't get like email or internet or anything on her phone. It's like really old school, and even she has a camera with very, very basic editing capabilities on it. So it's something that you don't need the most expensive high-tech phone to have. You just need a smartphone that has a camera on it, and it needs to be able to do some mild editing, but I'll show you that in a minute. So you're going to take whatever yarns you're looking at. So I'm going to use these two for our example. And then you want to try and, if at all possible, use natural light. So go over to a window, try to use natural light as opposed to like fluorescent lights, but you're not going to worry too terribly much about the actual colors in the skein. So if all you have is an overhead fluorescent light and you're in the back room of your local yarn store, that's okay. It's going to be fine. This isn't like high-tech photography. You don't need it to be perfect or fancy or whatever. You just need some light. Don't do it in all dark. But if you get the opportunity, try to get next to a window and do natural lighting. So after you lay your skeins down or hold them up, you're going to take your camera and you're just going to take a picture on your phone. That's it, literally just a picture of the yarn. Then you're going to go into your editing capabilities. So you're going to open up your picture in your camera. There should be a little button somewhere. If you have a touch screen, it should be somewhere on the touch screen there where you can click edit. go into where you would edit your photos, and then usually there will be somewhere in the editing menu, there will be an option for black and white. And you can click on that, and then like on my iPhone, I click the black and white, and then I can slide lighter or darker so there's more or less contrast. But once I get it in black or white, then I can see what's called the value of the color. So value basically just means how light or dark something is. So these two yarns have a much different value. This value is a lot darker than this one. So you're wanting to adjust that value, so you want to take out the color, so now we're not looking at, oh look, this one's blue and this one's orange, and that's how I know they're good colors together. Which, hint, by the way, is a great color combination because of art theory. But now we're not just worrying about the blue and the orange, now we're looking at how light or dark is this compared to this. That's the key to choosing good color work yarns. You want something where the values differ enough that there's a visible high contrast between the colors. So let's look at this picture I took of these two colors. When I go in and I adjust it, you can see that they don't have a very big difference between the two colors. It's kind of like, oh, they look on the surface like they're gonna go well together, and probably in large blocks of color they will, but if I'm just switching colors every 2 or 3 stitches or whatever it is for a Farrell pattern, suddenly these don't look like such a great option. So in that case, I would pick whichever one I wanted to work with more. Like let's say I really like this Day Drinker. So I'd hang on to Day Drinker and I'd say, okay, well that one didn't work, so let's try something that has more contrast. So I'm gonna try Is This a Kissing Book? And I'd put those together and I'd try taking a picture of those. Now we see then that one, the contrast is significantly higher. Now I've got a much different value between the two, and that is going to give me a much better result for color work. Okay? You can do this with as many colors as you like. I like to take whatever yarns I'm thinking about doing. Like let's see how these two do together. And then I've got a third one. However many yarns you need for your project, whether it's 3 or 8 or 20, line them up and take the picture, make it black and white. You don't need to do a lot of editing. You can literally just click black and white, that's it. And then check them and see how they do. And that will tell you whether you have enough contrast. Now, I don't have a hard and fast rule for you on how much contrast you need. Some of that is going to be an individual decision. When I was taking pictures for this podcast of yarn color combos, I decided, oh, I'm sorry, I don't like this. Let me try this again. I just wanted to see what I had here really fast. Okay. There is no hard and fast rule about how much contrast you actually need between yarns in order for them to be a good choice. A lot of this is going to be kind of up to you. But when in doubt, I would go for as much contrast as possible. If your eye is having a little bit of a hard time distinguishing in the black and white, then it's probably not going to be a good option. Here's an example of 3 colors that I pulled. And they look really pretty against each other on the surface, but I was worried about how will these actually work in color work? Because it's a little hard to tell. These are all pretty bright yarns. This one clearly is the darkest, and next to each of these, it's like, okay, there's probably enough contrast, but it's a little hard to tell, and sometimes you'll be surprised, like on this one. I really thought these had enough contrast until I did the black and white, and then I looked at them and was like, that's not enough contrast for me. I'm not happy with that. These ones can be a little bit tricky because they're different colors, they're in different color families, they're all kind of bright. So the black and white test is really, really helpful here. And what I found when I did these in the black and white test is that these make a beautiful, beautiful dark, medium, and light blend. So these would be perfect for a coffee at the Grand Stole or for one of the more intricate color work projects like an intarsia or a stranded knitting, something like that, because you have a lot of contrast between all 3, and that's what you're really looking for. And the other reason I wanted to pull one of these yarns, this is a lovely little yarn called Flower Child, and I liked this one because I wanted to show you that even in like variegated skeins like this or speckles, you can still look for that overall, is it light or dark or medium? You can still look for the values in a more multicolored skein. It doesn't always have to just be a solid or a semi-solid. It's really, really great to use this when you're working with speckles and variegateds as well. Here's an example of a couple of things that look really, really great together, right? On the surface. They have the same like oranges and yellows, kind of sunny light colors, kind of bright. They look like spring garden flowers. But how do these two do when we put them to the black and white test? So I hope that that little trick has helped you a lot with your color choices. It's really, really easy if you have a smartphone. If you're struggling finding the black and white editing option on your phone, I would highly recommend that you Google it with your specific phone. Like I have an iPhone X or an iPhone 10, so if I'm having trouble looking up how to do something on my phone, I will Google, you know, editing photos to black and white on iPhone 10. And a lot of times you can find stuff just by Googling it. If you're still struggling with that, if you have someone who's really tech savvy in your family, like I usually ask my husband, if you have someone tech savvy like a little kid or an engineer or somebody who's just really good with phones or computers, ask them. Or you can also always take it into your cell phone provider store and ask them. And it's a really simple thing, like not to make you feel dumb if you can't figure it out, because I struggle with things like that all the time. But it's a pretty simple thing, so that if you just walked into your store and asked one of the people at the cell phone store, I'm pretty sure they could figure it out for you pretty quickly. And it really will save you a ton of time, a lot of frustration, and money. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've bought yarns together thinking they'd look great, and then when I finally pick out a pattern and get all excited, I do the black and white test and I'm like, oh man, these aren't gonna work for that pattern. I'm gonna need to switch a couple of these out. But it saves me all that time and frustration. Now, this is probably not 100% foolproof. Nothing in life is 100% foolproof, especially when it comes to the creative endeavors like art and crafting. So I'm sure that there will be some exceptions out there that you could find, but in general, I've found that 99.9% of the time, this one does not steer me wrong. It really, really helps me make color selections with confidence, and it's pretty easy and quick to do in your local yarn store or in a booth at the yarn festival really quickly. Always ask if you're in a booth at a yarn festival, by the way. Always ask the seller or whoever's working the booth before you take a photo. I find that this test is a lot more accurate in general for me than some of the other ones I've read about. Like I've heard about you can place the yarn on the other side of the room and then stand like across the room and kind of squint your eyes. And if you see 3 distinct colors popping from your 3 skeins, then they're a good match. If they all kind of blend together, then they're not. I haven't had good luck with that one. I don't really feel like that gives me an accurate idea of whether or not this is going to work. So since the huge majority of us, especially if you're watching this on the internet, the huge majority of us have either a camera or a cell phone of some type that will allow us to do the black and white editing. If you can't do it on your camera or phone, you could always take the picture, put it on your computer, and then use, a photo editing software like Photoshop or something to edit it if you needed to. But to me, that's way too much work. I just do it on my phone and it's pretty simple and easy. So I hope that helps you and gives you guys the confidence, and hopefully this will start seeing more and more of you guys take on bigger colorwork projects like Fair Isle, Stranded, and Intarsia. It's really, really fun once you start doing them. They're kind of addictive. Cutting my first steek a couple years ago was highly addictive. It was so scary, but once I did it, I felt like Superwoman, and it's amazing how much fun they can be. So I highly recommend that you check that out and give it a go. Leave me a comment below and let me know if you try this trick. Let me know how it goes for you. If you like it, if you think it makes sense. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you later, but it is now time to cast off. Love you.